Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's HCMx Radio, the only podcast in the HCM arena that weaves current market research, HR technology, and industry leaders into each episode. Our HCMx Radio host is our Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, I'm Rachel Cook with Brandon Hall Group. I am the host of HCMx Radio podcast, and I would like to warmly welcome with us today Charlie Chung, the Vice President of Business Development from NovoEd. Hi, Charlie. How are you?
Very good. How are you, Rachel?
Fantastic, and I'm excited to chat with you today about some of the trends that we see in learning and development, some of the fads, some things that we can anticipate going into next year. But before we get started, I know you've been with NovoEd for about 6 years. You've been in the learning industry for about a decade or more. You hold an MBA from the University of Michigan. And, besides, the great work that you do at NovoEd, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and some of your experience in the learning industry, passion that you may have, and so on and so forth?
Sure, certainly, Rachel. Well, I switched over to the learning industry about 10 years ago, as you mentioned. Prior to that, I was in management consulting, did a lot of sales and marketing consulting work. And I realized that, in consulting, you work a lot on your clients' problems and such. And I realized that they didn't necessarily coincide with what I was interested in. I really started to think about what I wanted to do and found, as I look back at my career, I was always involved in learning and in training, either developing it for clients or for internal purposes. And I just found that was the passion of mine. So I decided to shift over, and I did a lot of study at that time. I did a lot of research on pedagogical principles, andragogy, so on. Wanted to get some grounding in the learning science. This was around the time when MOOCs became really popular. I got really excited about some of the potential there and some of the things that you can do in an online way and in a way that isn't just purely solo learning experiences. And that's how I got involved with NovoEd, because NovoEd started from that sort of background. So I guess one thing I would say is that I have sort of a convert's zeal in that I'm really excited and passionate about new ways of learning, new ways of teaching, and still trying to keep in mind actual learning science principles, which is why I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the sort of overblown fads where I feel that people take a germ of a good idea but go way overboard with it, and it actually doesn't do justice to what that pedagogical concept can really do, or to the learning science that's really behind it.
So that's a good way to segue into my first question. So let's talk about what are some of the fads that you feel that are just not going to have the longevity that we are, that companies should, plan for, especially around investments, thinking about, their resources, because obviously, any new idea comes with a lot of work as far as, as simple as it may be, but really to get the type of effectiveness and impact, what should we, or what do you see as some of the things that you think are fads?
Yeah, well, Rachel, in my observation in the learning technology space, I find that so many things, almost everything that is a major buzzword is typically just a little bit overblown as a fad, and people tend to look at it as a panacea. And so the buzzwords changed. There's a bunch of them out there. Some were more popular before and less so now. Some are still popular. But things like microlearning, personalized learning, reinforcement learning, social learning, a lot of these things, there are powerful concepts behind them and important concepts, but they've been sort of captured and put into a certain definition. Oftentimes it's by vendors that, kind of stake their service or technology upon those things. They tend to define it in a very specific, limited way. And then for some reason, the industry just kind of goes along with that definition and says, oh yeah, microlearning is like this, but it's not like that. Here's what that is. Personalized learning is like this, and not like other things. So I'm sure a lot of learning professionals feel the same way, especially those that really look to the learning science, in that the principles, the important key principles are not the same as the way we, vendors, companies, organizations kind of define those things today.
And you're very true. Vendors, which technology providers, they do drive the innovation. They do drive or disrupt the change. Sometimes it's for the greater, it's great. We need to think differently. We need to continue to innovate so that we can figure out how best to develop our people, how best to get them engaged. But then again, you have to, kind of looking at some of the trends we see now, and even if you look back 10 plus years ago, when we started seeing a lot of technology providers pushing from just a learning system to an integrated suite, that has everything from onboarding to learning to performance to payroll even, just companies were not ready for this. Not that it's a bad thing, it's just, sometimes we found so many companies that just were not, they invested in these integrated suites and they were only still using 1 or 2 modules, and they're in their 3rd or 5th year of having this platform, and then they were dissatisfied. Do you kind of see some of the similarity in some of these new fads that, that's kind of being pushed into the learning environment, whether it's for good or for bad?
Yeah, I do. And you bring up an interesting trend about the suites. And then there's kind of the pushback on the other side, which is point solutions. And so these point solutions, they hang their hat on a certain approach. So take, for example, microlearning. Now, microlearning is, foundationally a great concept in that we absorb information in small packets, one at a time, and they kind of build on each other. Absolutely true, right? That people know about the research around deliberate practice for skill building and all sorts of things. But somehow, when these technology platforms have encapsulated microlearning and saying, yes, we are a microlearning platform, they've somehow just limited it to being sort of fact-based recall. And they draw on the research around the forgetting curve and things like this. There's a whole bunch of research that's really based on sort of K-12 student learning. And yes, if you're trying to memorize the rules of math as you progress through algebra and trigonometry, that sort of microlearning absolutely makes sense. But when you talk about the kind of skills that organizations are trying to apply that to now, how to be a great coach, how to be a better leader, what does it mean to be customer centric? These sort of higher level skills, the microlearning is still stuck in the fact-based recall. Now the microlearning is, I'm going to present you with a quiz every 3 days, and the algorithm's so smart that if you answer a certain way, I'm going to give you another question in 2 days rather than 4 days. But it's still based around this paradigm of recalling facts and getting the right answers on a quiz. There's so much more potential with microlearning to chunk up things in smaller sequences, to provide nudges, to provide reinforcement, to scaffold, to build up to something bigger and richer and deeper, and to incorporate that microlearning into other kinds of learning as a scaffolding. Yet, because they've been sort of tackled by a certain class of companies that say they have a microlearning platform, it sort of becomes co-opted in that way.
So you feel that there's just not enough substance for some of the fundamentals for skill building, for the microlearning to be as intuitive perhaps, or as if it's just based on fact, reiterating your facts or remembering little things, but you have to understand what kind of skills that you're training for. And so the microlearning is just one channel but you have to then funnel it into kind of this overarching strategy. And the strategy piece is really important, and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I think that's right. When you look at, Bloom's taxonomy and higher levels of learning engagement, or you look at other frameworks and methodologies like that, things are supposed to ladder up to become more holistic, more applicable, more applied, and so forth, and relevant. And yet, if your microlearning is all about popping you quizzes of facts and you're responding with simple multiple choice responses, you're never going to get up that development path. So we really need to rethink that. Microlearning is an important concept, but it does need to be woven into other things. That is a place, I think, to your earlier question, Rachel, where there is a possibility where these suites can incorporate it in a much richer, more dynamic way, where it's woven into things. You can't rely on that mode of microlearning to take people up that skill ladder, but it can help push people up. And the overarching principle is an important principle, that you don't want to overwhelm people all at once, that people need to stay engaged in a sustained way to build skills in a sequence that makes sense for them. Another fad that is very dominant out there right now is this sort of learner-centered portal, where, hey, we're presenting this portal, there's 10,000 learning objects, we're going to present people with a search bar. It's like Google search. Or there's so many paradigms. You must have heard this 1,000 times, but the Netflix of learning, or Netflix style learning, right? Where this amazing recommendation engine is going to put things in front of you, just like just like the Squid Game or something is going to captivate people's attention. You're going to just all of a sudden be presented with these amazing learning objects. There's a lot of challenges with that model. Now, I'm not against having a portal and having recommendations. I do think AI technology is going to get better and better. But first of all, this violates the principle of the microlearning, which we talked about, in the sense that, if you're just jumping about from learning object to learning object, they don't necessarily have any connection to each other. And at least microlearning does that, right? Microlearning, you're trying to go and sustain on a certain skill and hopefully advance upon that skill. You're not just starting with a fresh Google bar each time, right? And then people just get very, people kind of confuse or mix up this idea between entertainment and learning, and they're not the same thing. You can't just present people with a Netflix style interface and expect them to be able to pursue all their development goals. We know about the paradox of choice. We know about cognitive load. If you present people with 10,000 options, you might as well be presenting them, with 50 million options. I mean, it's just choice overload. And, in the world of entertainment, where I could be entertained by 1,000 different things, and as long as it's great entertainment, I'm satisfied, that model might work well. But in a learning environment where I'm trying to be the next level leader, right, it's not the case that any learning will do. So there are specific things that are going to be important for me. And to the extent that the algorithms aren't good enough to get that right, having a Netflix style learning or having a big portal learning isn't a sufficient approach. Now, again, I'm definitely supportive of that. I would want that in my organization to look up things, but we shouldn't look at it as this is the development platform for our employees to give them a search portal with a string of tiled recommendations at the bottom.
I think with personalized learning, I think it also confuses sometimes the learner and the learning professional, because even if it's personalized, sometimes the learner does not always know what they need. And so if it's not done well, or if it's not really thought out with a taxonomy that, as we mentioned before, where you're building skills that add to something else, or their career, mapping to their career growth and opportunities, which it should, but I think though, oftentimes when learning environments or leaders, if they're trying to introduce a new concept, it's sometimes difficult to have, in the very beginning at least, to have that kind of bigger picture when you're trying to figure out this new fad or trend and how does it work in your environment and who can deliver it and what resources you have. And then, especially also for a lot of younger generations coming in the workplace, their expectations are, so far and beyond sometimes, with technology than organizations are ready for. Even though we can be the most innovative organization, it still takes time to catch up to that, to that trend or to that curve. So, I think that's kind of where we are in a lot of companies where, some maybe functions or some areas are doing it quite well, but not everyone. It's not available to everyone, or it hasn't been quite figured out yet.
Yeah, I think that, personalized learning is another term that's been co-opted, and sort of ironically, personalized learning now is defined as there's no person involved. It's like it's automated. There's an algorithm, an AI-driven engine that's personalizing things to the individual. And I just think that's unfortunate, because there's other ways to personalize. Learning is very important, but there's other ways to make learning personalized besides just having an algorithm. We just go to that default because it's just so hard for us to imagine scaling anything else. But in your example, for a new employee that's joined an organization, newly joined the workforce, what would be more valuable for them? They come to this portal, and then there's this Netflix style recommendation of here's some things that people in your track and position should be learning. Or is it something maybe where, just to throw something out there, something where that person's supervisor or maybe a category of peers who reached one level up and have a year or two of tenure in that role have said, hey, this is something that you should work on. And maybe that's the personalization. Now, there's a role for technology in this, right? So there can be a mix of what a person's manager suggests, what peers suggest, and using algorithms to help assist with that. So that to me is much more personalized than just saying, no, we've got great algorithms and this is going to solve our problems. Rachel, just a quick aside. I don't know, in the pandemic, one of the hobbies I've picked up is chess, playing online chess. But there's an interesting story of AI and computers in chess. And so for a long time, computers, we're talking about in the 1980s or so, computers could not play at the level of top grandmasters, not even close. And then there was a seminal moment, I think it might have been 1995, where IBM's, Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov. And then, people said, hey, everything's turned around. And what ended up happening is that what became more powerful even than computers were computer-assisted humans. So then when you had the top grandmasters, given the aid of a computer engine, they could still beat the top computers out there. And that lasted for quite some time, I don't know, a decade or more. And then we've reached the point more recently where now computers are so good that they're even better than the human-assisted computers. So it was a journey for AI in that sense. At first, the computers weren't as good, and then they were better than unassisted humans, but they weren't better than human-assisted humans. And then now they are better than, anything else that could be put up against them. So I think it's the same thing. We're very much in the infancy of AI in the learning sphere. And we're certainly at the point where humans are better than computers right now. And at some point, we probably will go through the phase where we have this hybrid, which I was kind of alluding to before, about maybe your manager, maybe the employee's manager gets an assist from an algorithm and says, here's 3 different types of learning paths that people in your direct reports, cohort benefit from. And then the manager uses their judgment to pick the right one, right? And they say, track B looks good, I'm going to recommend it. And not only am I going to recommend it, I'm going to explain to the person why. Here's why this set of skills is important, right? That's what an algorithm is not good at providing. It doesn't tell you the justification. So it can't help with that motivational piece. And then, yes, Is it possible that at some point in the future, the computers will be better than, let's get the humans out of the equation and just let the computers make recommendations? Sure, absolutely could happen. But we're a couple steps removed from that. And we should just keep in mind, when we talk about personalized learning, there's a lot of opportunities out there other than just saying, let's just toss it to the algorithm, at least for now.
I think that was some of the fear with introducing AI is where, where do people fit in if and when they become, better at predicting or developing, the learning for the employee. But I still feel that as everything matures, there's going to be something new that people are going to have to be able to help unravel, determine, apply. So there's always going to be a place for people in this fad or this trend that we're seeing in 5 to 10 years. It's going to evolve into something else that's being pushed out there through innovation and what's impacting us environmentally. So there's always a place for people, and I think that's some of the concerns when we introduce these new ideas, or people get more afraid of embracing them because they're so used to doing what they normally do. I think what we see are, what kind of leaders and employees we need are ones that are adaptable and that can embrace change. And more so that we saw what happened to us in the pandemic. People that thrive or that were able to continue, whether it was organizations or people, was the mindset, being able to have the ability to take in what's happening to them and be able to adjust and to adapt. And those, whether it's companies or individuals that had a harder time, in the new world where we're heading to, it's a skill that we're going to have to teach our younger people in order to be able to and not just younger people, like you talk about younger people, I think all people, I think we all need to learn and, be able to adjust and adapt to our new world.
I think that's right. And, I think the key is finding that balance between, adapting and also having a foundational base and knowing when to apply each. The role of learning leaders, first of all, it's learning leaders are more important than ever right now for all the reasons you just supplied. I mean, if you think about your learning leadership allows your organization to be flexible to the extent that your learning leaders are competent and doing their job. That your organization can be pliable in developing and adapting the skills that it needs for the future. So it's definitely more critical than ever. And there's so much technological change out in the world today. It's sort of transforming every industry, and so that's part of the reason why I think that there are these fads out there. I think there's a few reasons for that. One, it's because there's so much need, and there's so much changes out there, and there's this constant sense, not just on the learning and human capital side of the house, but also from executive leadership and business units, that hey, there's got to be better ways. There's got to be better ways to doing things. Look at all this technology that's out there. That's absolutely true, and we do need to embrace that, Rachel. But we also need to understand that we as human beings evolve very slowly. We still have habits that are, harken back to evolution from 50,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? So as people, as a species, we don't change very quickly. So that's why we really need to hearken to the learning science to tell us about things that are core for us. What is it that motivates, that drives humans? What is it that causes us to, question and understand and grasp things? There's so much there that we already know about humans, and that part is not going to change in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. Yes, the techniques can change, but they've got to access the same underlying pathways. And so that's why I think, we need to find this balance between, being open and adaptable. But for learning leaders who, know the learning foundations and pedagogical foundations better than anyone else in their organizations, it's their responsibility to bring people back to earth and say, hey, look, that sounds great, but that's not the way people learn. A great example of that is, just this concept of cognitive load. It's harder to learn things when when you're processing lots of different things. And you look at, computer-based training over the past 20 years, there was definitely a time, and not in the not too recent past, where everybody wanted to animate everything and put flashing and buzzing. And then with the gamification trend, people sort of picked up on the video game aspect of gamification, although there's other aspects of gamification that are maybe even more deeper than that around gameplay. But people picked up on the video trend and said, hey, my employees, play Angry Birds for 2 hours. Why can't I make my learning like Angry Birds? And then they've got these animations and things flitting around and flashing and so forth. And you think you might be onto something, but if you really look at it from a foundational standpoint, you've got to realize, hey, this is not great for cognitive load. It might be entertaining, but are we really allowing the space for people to absorb something? And the same is true with learning platforms and how busy they are. There's a move towards simplicity, white space, minimalism. Look at Google's search bar. This was something they understood 20 years ago. Very simple search bar, right? They're not flashing you with 6 different configurable sections with a panel of thumbnails that are flying by. So you've got to keep these things in mind as you embrace the potential for better techniques. You've got to keep these fundamental basics in mind.
Great advice. And as we wrap up today, I mean, that's, just simplicity. I mean, that's just, kind of giving people food for thought, as they're thinking into or thinking about all these different trends and fads. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, a couple thoughts, Rachel. One is, in this conversation, I do want to talk about how fads are overblown, but I'm not trying to dunk on the learning technology space. This is sort of to be expected when things are in flux, things are being disrupted. There's a lot of technology, there's a lot of new ideas, so things are going to be a little bit chaotic like this. One thing that I think causes some confusion and leads to some improper sort of paradigms or framing is that when people do look at the learning science of things, to make sure to keep in mind that they should really focus on adult learning and making sure that those concepts are applicable to adult learning. A lot of research that we have comes from childhood learning, K-12 learning, things around spaced repetition and other things like that were formulated on even adaptive learning. These things are formulated on teaching math to middle schoolers, right? So not to say that they're not applicable, but just keeping that in mind, that you want to focus on adult learners. And for adult learners, we know that what's important are things like context, meaning, connection, relevance, a lot of these things, right? So you need to look outside of just the learning techniques, but think about motivation, engagement, reputation, all these other human factors. So we need to keep those things in mind. I think as we move to sort of the future, it's certainly an exciting time. There's a lot of different techniques and tools now that are available. People are more engaged digitally, especially with the pandemic. Things have really accelerated by 4 or 5 years in terms of adoption and willingness to adapt and things like that. But we need to keep in mind the human element. I think look at the human toll of being on Zoom calls all day long and seeing your face in front of you. We're not used to. It's like being in an elevator all day long and staring at the mirror, right? We're not used to that. We're not used to, Zoom blow-ups of people's facial expressions and seeing every micro expression and, maybe taking those in as signals. That's a magnified level of information that we're just not used to. So I guess, the overarching point for me is, let's not look at technology as, the solution in and of itself. We are all humans. We can adapt to different technology. We can adapt different techniques, but we need to take that human side into account. So all of us need to become better psychologists. All of us need to be better read on cognitive science and understand things about biases, heuristics, the human psychology aspect. That's just so key in understanding how people are going to adapt to a particular technology and not just focus on building the latest and greatest technology for its own sake.
It's so fascinating too, the more that you dive into understanding the behaviors of how people interact with each other, how they react to there's so many tips and techniques that you can utilize. You mentioned biases, and you mentioned different ways that people can retain information. So I really do I'm a believer of really understanding the different approaches to learning, and and how to what approach you take and incorporate into your environment is beneficial to all that you do, and just to have a baseline, some type of commonality that maps to your vision, your culture and your organization. There's a lot of different methodologies that you can take and frameworks, and there's a lot of information out there, but going back to what you mentioned earlier, keeping it simple, and just kind of focusing on 3 to 5 different elements, and then kind of revisiting what they are and how they resonate to what you're introducing and what you're building is critical. And you can always change over time, but don't get overwhelmed, because there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of different approaches, a lot of different theories, and but bringing it back to understanding your environment, and then how to bring this home.
Yeah, right. One final comment there is that, as I've seen learning leaders in different organizations and the different styles and approaches that they take, the ones who are, bat a really high percentage in terms of successful initiatives and projects that they take on, they really have that kind of hard-hitting, practical, end-user focused pragmatism about them, right? They're not wowed by the bells and whistles. They're not putting out RFPs and saying, hey, I'm going to pick those who can fit the most requirements. They're really thinking about simple, basic. They're thinking about human motivation. They're thinking about very basic behaviors. Those types of that kind of mindset leads to very successful projects. Those who go for the bigger bells and whistles, it's a little bit hit or miss. Sometimes they'll have some great success and it'll be kind of written up in a case study. Oftentimes you come back later though, and it's like, hey, yeah, we tried that and it kind of fizzled, or it didn't really work. So I think what you said is a great point, in that, if you're really trying to improve things in your organization, you want to take a very pragmatic view and find those steps that are most reasonable and accessible. You don't want to just, think that you can leapfrog 2 or 3 steps ahead and say, oh, here's nirvana where everything works together seamlessly, and this is exactly how things people are going to interact and flow with all of this information, with all these processes, and hope for that. So I think that's a case for pragmatism in the face of all of these big trends and exciting things that are out there.
And just, one more thing, and I keep bringing it back to simplicity. Think of a big picture. If you have one really cool object on that picture with a lot of white space, or maybe a border, or if you have a big picture with 1,000 things on that picture, what are you probably going to remember more? That probably one cool object, that very simple palette. So kind of think of your learning like that. And again, Charlie, thank you so much for sharing. If our listeners want to find you or reach out to you for additional perspectives or advice and working with NovoEd, how can they find you?
Oh, absolutely. My email address is charlie, CHARLIE, @novoed.com, NOVOED, or connect with me on LinkedIn, Charlie Chung. Happy to engage in conversation and dialogue. As you can see, I'm passionate about the space. I've got some strong opinions. Happy to interact with those who want to dialogue about this as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to your team at NovoEd. We love working with you. You're a great company. And those that are listening, thank you. Hope you have a great week. And I look forward to our next discussion, Charlie. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Take care.
Take care.